Hello everybody and welcome to the fourth episode of this guide to F1. It's already the fourth episode. So in this episode, I'll be talking about the tracks, where does F1 race, how do these tracks work. In the previous episode, I talked about the drivers, and in the one before that, I talked about the cars. So go check out those episodes as well, so that we ensure that you fully understand this one and the 2 more episodes to come. So each track is different and each track is unique. So let's dive into what makes these tracks unique. What are their characteristics? How do they work? Generally, the F1 calendar consists of 21 races. This can change a bit depending on the year. Like this year, it was only 17 due to the COVID-19 pandemic. And some years it's a bit more, but generally it's 21 races. And these are usually held at 21 different tracks. Although again, this year they did some races at the same track for 2 weeks back to back. There's a combination of both street circuits and motorsport intended tracks where F1 races. So let's take a look at the differences between these two and what makes them challenging and different. So starting with street circuits. Street circuits are public roads which are closed off for an F1 event. Think of Monaco, Singapore, Melbourne, and Montreal. So these tracks are often harder and more dangerous due to the smaller runoff areas on either side of the track. So if the driver makes a mistake, it can mean into the wall and out of the race. Because these tracks are not intended for motorsport, they're much narrower, and this also means that there's less overtaking. So for example, in Monaco, the qualifying is probably most important of any race on the calendar. As in Monaco, there's barely any overtaking. And so if you put a good lap time in qualifying, this means you have a good position in the race. And if you are able to maintain this position throughout the race, this could mean that you either win the race or just end in a good position with a lot of points. On a street circuit, there's often low visibility, so the drivers can rarely see a corner ahead and can sometimes only see the entry of a corner. So this makes it hard to judge, and this is where the talent of the drivers comes in, which I mentioned in the previous episode. It's the feeling for the car, how much can I steer in, how fast can I take this? And on a street circuit, the balance is key. How much risk are you gonna take? How fast are you gonna go? But with the higher risk, there's a higher chance of ending in the wall and not finishing the race. On a street circuit, such as Singapore for example, there's a lot of abrupt corners, meaning more shifting, more abrupt braking, and so the driver cannot get into a flow as they can in, for example, Spa-Francorchamps in Belgium, where there's a much more flowy section to the track. And finally, there's also less grip on a street circuit as the asphalt is not intended for motorsport. So next, a look at racing intended circuits. F1 often also races at tracks which are intended for motorsport and used by other leagues. Think of Barcelona, Silverstone, Spa-Francorchamps, Zandvoort, and much more. The majority of the calendar is comprised of motorsport intended circuits. These tracks are generally faster and safer as this is what they've been designed for. For example, Spa is a motorsport intended circuit and is very fast, similar to Silverstone. This allows for more overtaking, and therefore your qualifying position is still important, but not as important as you can make up for it during the race. Tracks often consist of a combination of corners. Think hairpins, steady radius corners, chicanes, and much more. I'll go into detail into these corners a bit later. Tracks can be divided into 3 different sectors, Sector 1, Sector 2, and Sector 3. So why would you do this? Well, it allows the teams to analyze their race lap times per sector. So if you see that you're very slow in a certain sector, you can see, oh, this is a fast sector, so maybe we have to reduce downforce in that sector, but allow for less drag. And so that's how they can tweak their setup to gain faster lap times. So the elements of a track, this is part 3. So there's different types of corners. So there's chicanes, which are like serpentine or S-shaped corners. They're man-made and have nothing to do with the geographical layout of the track, but they're man-made to ensure that there's some extra challenge and some extra corners. And then there's on and off camber corners. So on camber corners are where the inside of the track is lower than the outside of the track. These are preferable. And then there's off camber corners where the inside of the corner is higher while the outside of the track is lower. And this is very challenging and even feared by the best of drivers. And And then there's a constant radius corner, which means that it's a steady and constant turn, and medium, fast, slow speed corners, which can be found in almost every track. There's fast speed corners in Silverstone, but there's slow speed corners in Baku and Azerbaijan, for example. And then there's a hairpin, which is almost like a U-turn, which is often very slow, I think 60 kilometers per hour, but it requires a lot of deceleration, and so that's also a hard corner for some drivers. So there's different segments of a corner. So there's the braking point. This is the point where the driver starts to brake. And then there's also the turn-in point. So the turn-in point is the point where the driver starts to turn into the corner. Generally, the drivers try to brake on a straight line. So they brake before the corner and then turn in. As if you brake heavily while turning in, chances are that you can lock up, which means that the tires stop spinning, but rather they start to skid over the track. This could cause flat spots and square off the tires. And then there's also the apex. So the apex in a corner is the point where you intersect the corner. Often that could be seen as the middle part of the corner, but it's the part where you go over the corner. And finally, the exit of the corner. This is the point where you get out of the corner when they get back on the accelerator pedal and start to make speed again. So finally in this episode is the racing line. The racing line can be divided into the geometric racing line and the ideal line. So the racing line is basically the path that the driver should follow along a track. The geometrical line is basically the perfect line. It's the line with the least resistance. However, this isn't always the fastest line, as it doesn't consider the previous and following corners. However, the ideal racing line is often fastest, as it considers the following corners and the previous corners. This means that it considers your position when entering the corner, but it also considers the exit. Let's say you're in the final corner and you need a good exit because you want to make a lot of speed on the next final straight. Well, that means that you want to take a longer line through the corner so that you have a better exit, and that you can get on the accelerator pedal earlier. Each driver has their own preference of maybe braking later and having a bit of a different racing line, but generally people will follow the ideal racing line. So in conclusion, there's a lot of different characteristics which makes F1 tracks special, both street circuits, motor sport specific tracks, but there's a wide variety of tracks which F1 fans enjoy. Personally, I think that Baku in Azerbaijan is quite interesting. It's a street circuit with some long straight sections which is very fast. Silverstone has some very fast corners which make for some good races. But there's also some more boring tracks like Barcelona. And this track, although it has a nice combination of corners, it's quite boring, there's not much overtaking, and generally the person who qualifies first, if he's in a fast car, will win. So that wraps up this episode. In the next episode, I'll be looking at the strategy of F1. Thank you, and see you in the next one.